Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. I'd like to welcome back onto the programme Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Richard.
Now, you might be getting sick of Andrew's face, but he's got something new to say every time he appears on the show. And we're going to discuss a link that we've not really addressed yet on Rich Planet, and that is a possible link between 9/11 and crop circles. Now, before you roll your eyes, I really advise you watch the entire contents of today's programme before you make a judgment. Now then, let's start with 9/11 briefly before we look at some crop circle research. If you're going to follow the hypothesis in today's programme, you really need to know first what happened on 9/11. And you can watch some interviews that I've done with Dr. Judy Wood on this subject from these links. But tell us about Dr. Wood, Andrew, and tell us about what she has discovered in her very detailed analysis of what happened on the day of 9/11.
The main thing really, Richard, is the destruction of the World Trade Center and how that happened, because the official story claims that the towers collapsed and the plane crashes and fires and so forth, which has been discussed endless amounts on the mainstream. But when you actually observe what actually happened, as Dr. Wood has shown us, is that the towers didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground. They mostly turned to dust in midair. And you can see this in various ways. And in her book you'll see the seismic evidence, and you'll see the visual evidence, and you'll hear the witness testimony in there. And so what you then have to ask yourself is, how can this have happened? How can these buildings have mostly turned to dust before they even hit the ground? And the conclusion that you come to is it wasn't bombs, it wasn't planes, it wasn't anything like that. It was some type of technology which was to do with the generation of some type of energy field. It was an energy weapon of some kind that was used to destroy the towers. Right,
which, as you say, when you study the evidence, appears that it has caused, or at least certain metals within the towers, to change their state without getting hot. So it turned them into a powder, and there is other evidence that this was some form of energy weapon.
Right, and that's all in the book. And so again, that's one of the key issues that you've picked on there, is the heat, the issue of heat, because the plane crashes, of course, they create heat from the fires, from the fuel, and these alleged bombs that people have talked about, they would create a lot of heat to sort of would be involved in the destruction. But when you look at the evidence, you find that there's actually only a very small amount of evidence which indicates any amount of heat.
All right, and as I say, I recommend you watch those videos or even read the book. It's a 500-page, very detailed scientific study by a former professor of engineering mechanics. So the observations and evidence in that book they're irrefutable, in my opinion, and they do point to something non-disclosed. Let's put it that way, because all of the explanations that you've listed, because this is what human beings do with human nature, they jump to an explanation that they already know about, like it was done. They put bombs in the building,
right,
or the airplanes actually must have caused the towers to collapse.
Sure.
Rather than just study the evidence and say, well, this is the evidence, this is what happened, therefore none of those explanations fit. So it was something that the public have not been told about, which probably was some form of covert energy weapon. Now, if we accept that, because obviously you've spent a lot of years looking in a great deal of detail at probably nearly every piece of 9/11 evidence you could get your hands on, and you come across this evidence of iron microspheres, right, which is going to link into what we're going to talk about, crop circles. But just tell us about that evidence and where it came from.
Well, what I'd become interested in was this research of Stephen E. Jones. I become very interested in that in 2006, and then it was in 2009 that this character, with other people, published this paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, and it detailed their discovery of iron-rich microspheres in the World Trade Center dust. They'd allegedly had a sample of dust from the World Trade Center, and they'd put this under an electron microscope, and you can see the pictures in this paper that you can find on the internet. And they'd said that this was a fingerprint of thermite. So they were saying that these spheres were caused by thermite or nanothermite having been reacting, and that was therefore proved that the mechanism of the destruction of the World Trade Center was that thermite was used. That was their argument. But I'd also been aware at that point that Stephen E. Jones was involved in cold fusion research in the 1980s, which is an energy phenomenon. I was already aware of that. So we got these iron-rich microspheres in the World Trade Center dust, and I'd heard about these elsewhere in a separate video as well, not to do with 9/11.
Right, so you felt that these iron microspheres were very important evidence pointing to something unconventional, even though Dr. Stephen E. Jones, or Professor Stephen E. Jones, had tried to say that they were caused by a thermite reaction.
Right.
You don't think they were
No.
the iron microspheres were a result of a thermite reaction?
Correct. And the reason why was at that point in 2009, I already knew that thermite couldn't have played any significant role in the destruction of the World Trade Center, because, simply going back to what we said a few minutes ago, thermite doesn't turn things to dust. It also creates a lot of heat. It's a very hot reaction when it gets going. So it didn't fit what the evidence from the World Trade Center showed. So in other words, this was a cover for something else. Jones was pointing to this evidence as a way of covering up something else.
You believe?
I believe.
Yeah. Now then, and if we just mention cold fusion again, because in 1989, when this physics panel voted that cold fusion had no legs and it was founded on no good evidence, Stephen E. Jones was running that panel, or
yes, he led the vote.
He led the vote,
yes,
to, well, you might use the word debunk cold fusion and make sure that no further money was spent researching it. So,
right.
So you believe he was involved in the cover-up of cold fusion?
Yes, I would say he was.
Right.
Correct.
So you also believe that he's involved in the cover-up of what the iron microspheres might really be?
I think so.
At the World Trade
Yes.
Center, or in the World Trade Center dust?
Yes.
Okay. So you then saw some other research pertaining to crop circles where these iron microspheres turn up again.
Correct. This was in a video by Chuck Missler. I originally heard about this. It's quite a few years old, probably made in the late 90s or early 2000s. And he talked about these iron microspheres being found in the soil underneath where a crop circle had formed. And I looked at this research by W.C. Levengood, and it was published on the BLT research website. And looking at the pictures there and looking at the dimensions of these spheres, they were of the same dimensions as the spheres that were mentioned in the Stephen E. Jones paper, and that it was in the order of 10 to 40 microns in diameter. That's less than the width of a human hair, very tiny, sort of little spheres which you need a microscope to see. So what were these doing in crop circles? And as W.C. Levengood observed, these were magnetized. And he said that they seem to have been formed in the presence of a strong magnetic field. And so that was very interesting to me.
Right. So just to interject there, a couple of things, a couple of points. How can iron get into a crop circle? Well, soil is made of 50 to 200 parts per million of iron. We have iron in soil. We also have in fertilizers up to 20% of some fertilizers are iron, and 5% of the Earth's crust is made of iron. So you would have iron in the ground that possibly, if some phenomenon was applied to that ground, could form tiny spherical balls of iron. And then he concludes that a magnetic field was involved in some way.
Correct.
Now, the other thing I just want to touch on with regards to Levengood, there are people who have tried to discredit him by saying that he didn't have the qualifications that he said he did. Can you just comment on that?
Yes, so I mean, there was one particular crop circle researcher who I believe is Welsh, and he'd claimed that Levengood had said that he had a PhD, and he went around calling himself Dr. Levengood, and PhD. And if you look at the BLT research website, where a fair amount of his research is published into the crop circle science that he did. I can't see any evidence that he claimed to have a PhD anywhere in there, you know, either as doctor or PhD or whatever. So to me it seemed like somebody was trying to cast aspersions on Leavengood for no particularly good reason.
Right, and the other thing that he has looked into is, because we're going to talk about actual crop circles in a moment, the other thing he's looked into is the effect on the nodes and the stems, whereby they seem to have been heated, so the water has made the stem become weak, and it's then forced into a particular pattern to create the crop circle.
Right.
And he's done research into that. So let's now come on to crop circles, because I made a film in 2010 called Crop Circles, The Hidden Truth, and please go and watch it from this link, because this is two pieces of research that really I think you probably need to understand before you can consider what Andrew is saying here. That's my own film, Crop Circles, The Hidden Truth, and also the interviews with Dr. Judy Wood about 9/11 evidence. But in my film, I followed the work of David Caton and Robert Hulse, who for many years have been analysing crop circles, get down on their hands and knees and look at the evidence on the ground, and they developed fairly reliable techniques that allowed them to identify which crop circles had been made by flattening with planks of wood. They would search for these particular bruise marks or board marks within a crop circle, and their research revealed that a small number of crop circles weren't made with that process. So I'm just going to show a clip from the film, and this shows Robert and David investigating crop circles and showing the evidence that they find in a man-made crop circle.
The board impacts the stems and damages the stems, so that's something you have to really get down hands and knees job to look closely, and they're not easy to see unless you know what you're looking for.
We've just come in the formation, and disappointing immediately to find evidence, physical evidence of mechanical damage, and the lay is very unimpressive, very flat, and there's board marks all over the place, which is a terrible disappointment in view of our high hopes of moments ago. And down here, just as an area in one of the spiral paths near the centre, and you can see board mark, board mark, there and there and there.
So if it's like a 3-foot board, you'll find rows of stems more or less lined up, and when you turn the stem over, that doesn't occur on the opposite side.
Well, if we walk into this small circle and come over here, I have a feeling that I found the board marks fairly easily this time. Oops, a daisy. And here we are. If we come down here, we can see that we have a board mark. And if we come over here, here we have another. So we have two of them fairly close together, which is how they should be. A row of what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I think there's a typical crease there, and I'm bending it slightly, and then you come back towards the camera a little bit, and there we've peeled off the outer sheathing of and you can feel that with your fingernail. And then if you come back even further to where the tip of the dowsing rod's pointing, there's another one. It's again not too deep. You also can see a bend it there. You can see how the crease bends back.
So that's pretty clear that those crop circles have been made by people with planks of wood. Now I'm going to show you a clip from another crop circle, and this was the Ogbourne St George crop circle, which in my opinion has not been made by the same process as trampling with planks of wood. Let's just take a look at that.
Certainly genuine formation. I mean, the main thing about that was the way the crop had been laid. It wasn't flat to the ground. It was laid like the grooves of a record, wasn't it, Dave? So yeah. The top bit of lay was probably only a few inches below the general level of the crop in the field.
To illustrate what Robert means by the grooves of a record, we can zoom into the circle in question.
The arrow here shows where the photograph to the right was taken. From ground level we can see the disturbance has occurred just a few inches from the top of the crop, but this has a significant visual effect when viewed from above. Ask yourself, what could create this kind of effect? Certainly not a plank of wood.
Then the next band, which is slightly higher, then lower again, then higher, then lower, then higher, and so it goes on right across this circle. The effect is so delicate.
Now, clearly there's something different going on there, Andrew, in that video, and in the film, if you want to go and watch it, I actually did quite a bit of digging on, well, one particular individual who has been responsible for a large number of crop circles from 1992 into the mid-2000s. And in that film, I provide a lot of circumstantial evidence linking him to MI5. And it is my firm belief that the whole man-made crop circle phenomenon is sponsored by British intelligence, and all the evidence for that is in the film. And I just want to point out something which isn't in the film about the crop circle makers, and that is that over a typical season you might get between 100 and 140 crop circles made. That's approaching one per day, and it takes best part of the night to make a crop circle with maybe 5 or 6 people in a team. Some of these crop circles are huge, and I know from my research that one of the crop circle teams, or the team that I investigated, lives in Devon, another one lived in London and other parts of the UK. So these guys are coming together in Wiltshire and other counties, and they're spending a full maybe 120, 130 days, like 4 months of the year, full time I would say, making crop circles, right? Now that doesn't sound like a prankster to me, over a period of at least 18 years, right? So the person who I name in the film, he also alludes to the fact that he has someone who's funding him, right? And there are all sorts of clues linking him to MI5. Now, it's all revealed in the film that I made in 2010. So, my film suggests that there are at least two different causes of crop circles, the vast majority which are made by these types of teams that I've just described, and the small number which can't really be explained easily, such as the Ogbourne St George one. Now, which iron microspheres have been found in, that we've also appearing at 9/11. Now, not only have you discovered that iron microspheres have been found at 9/11 and in crop circles, but you've discovered that there are other pieces of evidence or effects that appeared at 9/11 and in crop circles. So, do you want to continue it from there, Andrew?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the other factors is this. We talked about the issue of a lack of heat at the World Trade Center during its destruction, commensurate with the actual level of destruction. And I was intrigued again to find on the BLT research a study by another scientist, Dr. Robert C. Reynolds. He's talking about the soils which he took from the crop circle, you know, from underneath where the crop was. He then did what's called an X-ray diffraction study, XRD, and that looks at how the crystals actually formed in whatever compound you're looking at. And he says in this quote, "The possibility of crystal growth seems remote. The degree of pressure known to be involved in causing crystal growth in sedimentary deposits would have, had it been present, completely obliterated the plants. And the 600 to 800 centigrade temperatures over a period of several hours known to be necessary to promote such crystal growth in the laboratory would have, in the crop circle field, incinerated any plant present. Additionally, the very brief bursts of possibly intense microwave radiation thought to be the cause of node elongation and the creation of expulsion cavities through the heating and expansion of the internal stem moisture could not account for crystal growth." So to try and sort of summarize what he's saying there, he is describing what he observed in the X-ray diffraction study, the evidence that these crystals should have been formed when there was heat there. But around that, in the crop, there was no evidence of heat because the crop wasn't burned, the crop wasn't incinerated. And this is quite similar to what Dr. Wood found in the evidence from 9/11, where, for example, we had some of the police cars which had been damaged, and the metal of the car was very badly, severely damaged, looked like burn marks, and the plastic on top of the car for the light assembly, that was undamaged in some cases, and similarly some of the upholstery was undamaged, while the metal in the car was quite badly damaged. And there are a number of other situations, like with the dust, where people breathed in the dust and the dust wasn't hot, it was cool, yet we saw other effects which appeared to be the result of heating. So that's one aspect. In other words, the evidence for what looked like heat, but evidence right next to it where there was apparently no heat.
So what you're saying is that there's an effect being applied, and we're not quite sure what that is, which has caused something which looks like heat was present but clearly wasn't.
Correct.
In both this crop circle evidence and in the 9/11 evidence. Now we've got further evidence to do with effects on people at 9/11 and in crop circles.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
Yes, so the other evidence that came up when I was looking at this was Dr. Wood had catalogued the evidence of levitation, where people had been lifted off the ground. And we have a number of witness accounts of this. During the events of the destruction of the World Trade Center, for example, there was a New York Daily News photographer called David Hansher, and I believe we may have even played this clip on a previous program that we did, where he was levitated, carried a block. We had another witness called Michael Mako. He was also experienced levitation effects. I think he dove under an ambulance, and the ambulance then was lifted up while he was sheltering under it, and it blew away. We had Blaise Pasquale, who seemed to surf down tens of floors within the World Trade Center during its destruction. And we had the upturned cars, which seemed to have been flipped over. But then, switching to the crop circles, I've seen two separate witness accounts of people being levitated in the vicinity of a crop circle, one being Freddie Silver, and we'll play that clip, so it's very brief, and the other being Pat Delgado, who was a fellow researcher of Colin Andrews. Pat Delgado is sadly no longer with us.
Mm-hmm. So we'll just have a listen to that clip from
Freddie Silver.
I've been levitated off the ground in a crop circle, much to my amazement, which still baffles me to this day. I never would have exchanged...
How high up did you go? Just a few inches, or did you go way up there?
I have no idea to this day.
Really?
It was 1997 when I went into a circle, and about the time when everything about sound was concreting in my mind. Everything was pointing to sound for me. Again, by the sheer fact that I've been working with Isabel Kingston for quite such a long time, and as a musician, I just went in that sort of general direction. And I played this tape of this music, and I lay down in a crop circle in 1997 in England, a beautiful, beautiful pattern. And I just remember being knocked out, a huge blow just being hit on the back of my shoulders, which actually it didn't hurt. It's almost like, as a joke, like Dr. Spock came up behind you and knocked your, pinched one of your nerves. And I just sort of relaxed. I just began to rise out of my body. I could see my hands flying around me.
People might think it's really bizarre that people have been levitated by something, but the statements seem reliable, and there's more than one statement from multiple witnesses. So there's a third effect that you've observed with 9/11 and in crop circles.
Yes, and this is something that I had a brief discussion with David Caton about a couple of weeks ago when we were at the conference at Homford. And this is to do with what I call residual effects in the ground. And we've got some pictures, again, I've got a couple here, where we see the previous year's crop formation imprinted on the new crop, which is growing through in the next year. And I would argue that this, wouldn't normally be seen as the effect of one that's been created with a plank, because it's so distinct, this design coming through in the next year's crop. So I would argue that this was an energy imprint, that some type of energy was used to create the original design. That energy, there was some residual effect in the soil, possibly on the crystal structure, as we already discussed earlier, which then affects to some degree the growth of the new crop. And so we had those residual effects in crop circles, and then what is lesser known at the World Trade Center is the fate of what's called the Bankers Trust, or the Deutsche Bank building, which was across the road from the World Trade Center. That was damaged during the destruction of the World Trade Center, and this is covered in some of Dr. Wood's talks, and I understand in her book as well. And you'll see that that building was repaired, and by about 2006 they'd repaired the Bankers Trust building to a sort of state it was before the destruction. And then they announced that it had some type of mold infection, and the structure of the building had become compromised, so they decided to take it down piece by piece. And if you look at some of the pictures of this deconstruction, there seemed to be a very high level of rust in certain areas, as if, again, these ongoing effects have continued to be affecting the material from which the building is made, and they've had to then dismantle it.
So what you're saying is, in the World Trade Center, assuming a weapon was used which is non-ballistic, energy-based, perhaps some sort of field as well, or radiation or electromagnetic in nature, that once the weapon's been switched off, effects have continued to go on for years?
Years, indeed, yes. Yeah.
And you're saying that there's been residual effects in some crop circles?
Yes.
Now, interesting that I mentioned David Caton before, and what they would do is that the first thing they would try and identify is whether it's a planked or an unexplained crop circle. And once they've done that, they would do other tests. And David, in this next clip, is actually in a crop circle which they believe is in the unexplained category. In other words, the crop has been bent without breakage or bruises, like the Ogborn St George one. And we'll see what happens in this clip.
He has found that the formations which he believes to be man-made produce nothing more than background radiation. However, on two separate occasions, David has measured effects on his Geiger counter in non-man-made circles. In this case, David's meter reads 18 times higher than the normal background level. David telephoned the National Radiological Board headquarters from the crop circle and spoke to an instrumentation expert. He believes that the effect on the meter was not caused by dangerous particle or ionizing radiation, and the cause was probably electromagnetic in nature, although one cannot conclude where the source of this energy is.
So he's measuring some sort of radiation or electromagnetic energy in that crop circle that he thinks has been created with a non-mechanical means.
Yes.
Right?
So he's actually measuring this residual effect, isn't he? Because the crop circle has already been made, he's gone there, and he's there after the event, and he's making these measurements. And
I have heard stories of people who've been in certain crop circles who they feel sick,
yes,
or other effects as well on people's anatomy. All right, now let's go down the hypothesis then that the World Trade Center was destroyed with a weapon, and it had these effects that you've described, and that's something similar to what's been used in the unexplained crop circles, right? We can hypothesize as to where that weapon might be. And in order to possibly shed light on that, I'm going to show you a clip. This is from 1990. This was filmed by researcher Roy Dutton, who's featured in my crop circle film, of a farmer who describes some extremely strange 2.5 feet diameter black tubes which went right the way up out of his view into the sky. Just take a look at this.
Looking across diagonally, looking at the wood behind, it was to the left, about halfway along the wood line that you can probably see on the film. The first one, where I stood in the field nearby, and then when that died away, the second one appeared nearer the tree, over near the woods in the far distance, and suddenly in front of me was a tube running up about 1,000 feet. Oh, well, I'm not a good judge, but I would say 1,000 feet plus, or coming down out of sight onto the ground. This was not very many yards away from me, but the important point about it that struck me with it was the circular motion of the ashes in the grit on the ground. It didn't appear to be being sucked up the tube. It was just rotating at high speed on the ground, about 2 feet wide, 2 feet 6 perhaps on the ground.
All right, Andrew. So the farmer's actually describing some rotation in these black tubes, and I think it's probably fairly well accepted that most crop circles are made at night. So if those tubes were something to do with crop circle formation, if that was used at night, then possibly no one would see it. So maybe this is an example of early testing of something that has been applied to use crop circles, to create crop circles. Now, so let's go a step further and spell out what we're saying here, and that is that through the 1990s there may have been testing of energy-based technologies which can be focused and cause changes in matter and things on the ground that were being tested that was similar to something that was used on 9/11. And really there's only one place where I think, my view, where that would be, which is on a platform in space in orbit around the Earth.
Yeah, I mean that's where the logical place where it would be out of sight, at least to most people, and it's coming from above. And of course, we were discussing this earlier, that a lot of people have tried to kind of ridicule this idea of having space-borne technology, doing things on the ground. And this is something that, of course, Dr. Wood has been lambasted for, even though she's never actually said that she knows that the weapon is in space. We don't know where it is. We don't even know in the case of the World Trade Center. We don't have, for example, for the World Trade Center, we don't have any witness accounts describing 2.5 foot thick black beams coming down from the sky. To my knowledge, I've never read such accounts, so we don't know if it's any relation to what this farmer witnessed. But
can I just interject there, Andrew? There was 24-foot diameter circular holes in some of the buildings. Yeah, correct.
So maybe it was the case that they needed to do this differently because they knew they were going to do it in daylight, so they had to do it a different way. These effects did not show up. The black beams did not show up. We don't know. That bit is, we were speculating on that. But it is true, as we were saying earlier, that they did. Ronald Reagan announced in the 1980s this SDI program, the Strategic Defense Initiative, where he was going to build this space-borne peace shield which would protect the United States against the Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, and all of that propaganda that went along with it. And that was a heavily funded defence program, and as seems to be the case with these programs, there's a proportion of that money that gets siphoned off into black, unacknowledged special access programs, USAPs as they've sometimes been called. So what did they develop in those programs? Obviously we don't know, we don't have access to that information, we can only speculate.
Right, now then, there's a very well-known UFO commentator who used to work for the government who's actually made comments himself about an energy weapon technology. Just tell us about that.
So I'll get that quote.
So this is Nick Pope, who used to work for the Ministry of Defence, and he used to work at the UFO desk for I think about 3 years in the early 1990s, and he would receive reports and investigate some of them. Now, Nick Pope doesn't work for the MOD anymore, but a lot of people think he's still influenced by them and speaks in lots of conferences on various different subjects. So just give us this quote, Andrew.
This is round about November or December 2002 that Nick Pope said this. He said, "I had to refute the bizarre idea that the formations were caused by the testing of space-based laser or directed energy weapons, and dispel suggestions that media coverage of the issue had been stifled by the use of D-notices." And D-notices are these situations where they say that this breaks the Official Secrets Act, so they have to sort of pull the article from the press or whatever it is.
Right, it's interesting how he's worded that. Yes. I had to refute the bizarre idea that the formations were caused by testing blah blah blah, because that wording sounds to me like he's been told that he has to say that. I don't know if this is true, but it seems the way that he's worded.
Peculiar wording, rather than saying I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that that's what it was. Right. He doesn't use that wording. he says, I had to refute it.
He had to refute what we're setting out today.
Right.
Now then, let's just mention, because there will be people sitting at home who are just saying, what are they talking about? They're all made with planks of wood. And really, you have got to go and watch my film on this. But in that film, what I asked David Cate and Robert Hulse to do was to show me the crop circles that they've got board marks in them, so they've definitely been made by planks of wood, with people stomping the crop, and other ones which they found definitely were not made with planks of wood. This other hidden explanation with some energy effects. And if you put them side by side, we were just looking at these earlier, and I actually asked, in the film I actually say to Robert and David, well, is it the case that the man-made ones with the stomping are more complex? And Robert Hulse scratches his head and says, well, it seems to me that the ones that are made, that we know were created with planks, were more arithmetic, and the other ones had a more organic quality. And I actually think that, we saw the clip with the farmer there, he said that the beam was spinning like this. I think the non-man-made ones are made with some sort of rotational energy, which actually I think explains the formations, whereas the man-made ones have a lot more straight lines and cubes,
yes,
and that kind of look like they've been drawn on an engineer's drawing board, as Robert Hulse explained. So I suspect that the thousands of crop circles that have been made using planks, that I think is sponsored by covert agencies, was done so that people can't tell the difference between the two and really just think that they're all man-made. And a lot of people seem to look at these crop circles and interpret them and come up with all kinds of theories as to certain entities are communicating with them, messages and what have you. Now, I'm not refuting that as an argument, right? I'm not saying that there might not be non-human intelligences which have been responsible for some crop circles. I think that's possible, right? But all I'm doing is looking at this evidence, right, which shows a parallel with some 9/11 evidence, and perhaps points to a more man-made phenomenon, even though it's not been made with planks of wood.
Yeah, well, I think, if we go on to that in relation to the themes of some of the crop formations, and we spoke about this earlier, and something I noticed in around about 2010, 2011 sort of time, around about then, that there was a lot of crop formations they were put into the Daily Mail, pictures of them, and all to do with the Mayan calendar. So this seemed peculiar as to why this would be encoded in crop circles. Why was our attention being focused on the end of the Mayan calendar? And some people were claiming it was going to be the end of the world, or there was going to be this mass spiritual awakening and so forth, which to me doesn't really seem to have happened, at least not the way I see things. People might argue with me.
Did you not spiritually wake up in 2012, Andrew?
Well, not really, no, I'm afraid not. I mean, maybe I missed out, but I don't think there was some key event that happened to me then. Some people would argue that it was kind of the cusp of a turning point, like a point of inflection perhaps in the way that things are going. I don't know, but I don't want to debunk the idea totally, but what was curious is that we had a lot of these crop circles with Mayan symbolism put into them and getting us to focus on that. And that one, therefore, if we take what we've proposed tonight, that there is this energy technology which has been used to create some of these formations, we don't know how many, then would that be being used as a way of injecting certain types of information into the New Age movement? And the symbolism in crop circles has been quite powerful in the sphere of people that are interested in it.
Yeah, and what I found is that people are so bowled over by these incredible patterns, and they've clearly got meaning in them, such as to do with eclipses or to do with the Mayan calendar, as you mentioned, and Nazca lines and all kinds of other themes. Right, and they will immediately start interpreting them rather than to say, well, what's really behind it and who's made it. So they're not bothered about what happened as to how it was created. They're just interpreting it, which to me, you really need to know who was behind it before you start interpreting it.
Yes.
And as you say, it's a different medium of communication, isn't it?
It is. Yes. Yeah.
Because on the surface, it would seem to some that it's not been through our media, because anyone can actually stand on top of a hill or get a photograph from Nancy Talbot or whoever and see it in its pure form. So it's not being messed with by media or what have you. That would be a way of, let's say, a non-human intelligence passing a message onto everyone rather than a government.
Yes.
So you can see why people get enthralled by the whole phenomenon.
Yes.
But the question I ask is it being used to implant certain ideas within certain, well, new religions, if you like?
Yes, and I mean, one of the circles or formations that intrigued me, which we talked about earlier, was the alien head. And this was the crop formation where it showed what appeared to be a grey alien holding a compact disc. And this to me was certainly, whether this was made by Planck's or whether it was made by this energy technology or whether it was made by, an external group of beings, I really don't know myself. I think David Caton has perhaps got more information on this particular one, but whichever method was used to create this formation, what is intriguing to me is the intricacy. For example, it includes an English message which is encoded into the ASCII code, that's the American Standard Codes for Information Interchange, which is essentially a code of binary. So they had to, in other words, had to write out this message, which was, if my memory serves me correctly, beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Believe there is good out there, and we oppose deception. I might have got some of this in the wrong order, and then a comma at the end. Who decided, for example, that it would be binary encoded in in ASCII form? Who decided that then that would go into the spiral formation inside a CD? Who conceived this? Where did that idea come from? And why was it put in a crop formation? Those are questions which I don't have answers to, but I think those are questions that one should ask as to what the motivation was. And why was it in English? Why wasn't it? And in that sense, it was an unusual formation because most of the others don't have a literal English message in them. They're more symbolic, pictorial, pictograms, and this sort of thing. So that really, really did intrigue me as to what was behind that particular formation.
I think that formation, I've had a lot of people sending me emails, well, wow, what do you think of this? This could be a message from an alien race and things like that. So people were sold on that idea more on that crop circle than they were on the other just symbol crop circles.
Yes.
So it possibly took people down an avenue better than just the symbolic ones, because it actually had a message and a picture of an alien, right? Which I'm not saying it's disinformation or cover. Well, I think the vast majority of crop circles are a cover for the tiny few that have this unexplained aspect. I don't know what the unexplained aspect is.
Yes, and I mean, we also know that the military are interested in it. Some of that is in your film as well, but we talked earlier about Colin Andrews and Operation Blackbird, where he had the uniformed military officers on the field, and I know that you'd also spoken about that. But we know that the military is interested in this phenomenon, which is proves to me that it's not just people stomping and making these weird graphic designs. There's something else to it.
Yeah, and well, with all disinformation, which is what the crop circle phenomenon is, in my opinion, it's done to either confuse, muddle up, or hide something, which is where we've seen it with 9/11. We've seen it with the UFO phenomenon. We've even seen it in the Madeleine McCann case.
Yes.
In my opinion. All right, well, let's mention, because you mentioned Colin Andrews, somebody who was working with Colin Andrews, I think 2009, Paul Weige, who was an expert on crop circle research and other things such as computer encryption techniques. He had an engineering type background, and he would take all kinds of measuring devices into different crop circles. And one of the things he was working on before he died, he was only 43 by the way, was he had alleged to have detected audio frequencies. So this isn't EM radiation or what you think is at play in, say, the World Trade Center. This is audio frequencies. And during that research, or at some point, because I think he'd arranged to meet with Colin Andrews in the crop circle season that was about to, in probably 2009 and 2010, but he just walks into the sea, and then his body is discovered, an open inquest, so they don't know that he committed suicide, and they don't know he was murdered. And I think it's possible that Paul Weigel was getting close to something.
Yes, yes, and I mean, we discussed this as well, and I did meet Paul Weigel in 2006 at a conference, and he was a very nice young man, basically, and obviously very intelligent, you said, very knowledgeable, very skilled in what he was doing. And he also was interested in a lot of the other topics that you and I are interested in. And for example, he had 9/11 type postings on his website, as well as the crop circle stuff and some of the other topics. So did that have anything to do with the facts that he was?
I think the other problem in work, if let's say he was murdered, the other problem in working out why he was murdered is he was very much into data encryption, and what as far as I'm aware, he'd been communicating with people in the House of Lords, and he'd been educating some of the Lords on data encryption and saying how it is so important for people's freedom to be able to encrypt their data reliably and not have back doors into their data. And because obviously it's not the sort of thing that your average Lord is going to know about.
Yes,
yes. So when they're passing laws on data encryption and whether governments should be able to spy on your data, MPs generally don't know how to vote because they're not experts on the subject. But he was educating people in the House of Lords, as what I've heard, on data encryption. So that could be another reason.
Another reason, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I didn't know
so, that. But there's all sorts of weird circumstances about his death.
Yes.
That he's supposed to have posted his passwords or something through the letterbox. But there's no evidence that he posted those passwords, because I think one of the passwords didn't work. So I think it looked as though someone was trying to plant evidence to suggest there was a suicide.
Yes, yes.
But it could have been not him that's done it. So, hey, if anyone wants to investigate and make a film and expose a story, get your teeth into that one. The mysterious death of Paul Weigel.